All right. Hello, everyone. I've got Dr. Joshua Bowen here with me this evening, and we're going to be talking about. Well, I made a video a while back where I was talking about how the prophecies that they always brag about are unfulfilled to the best that I could work them out. And I looked at the prophecies, each one that, give me some of your best prophecies, and they did. They gave me a handful of their best prophecies. And when I look at those prophecies, I realized that they're not at all fulfilled. There's no way that you could interpret that as fulfilled prophecies. Well, Christians can't accept that their prophecies have not been fulfilled. So they've got to come up with some kind of excuse to go against it. And then my favorite excuse that I've ever heard was that the Bible is written in prophetic language, and the bullshit excuse with that is that somehow it can say what it says, but mean something else at the same time, so that it's actually talking about the people that it says that it's talking about, and that it really does pertain to 700 years ago or whatever. But then also at the same time, the exact same sentence, if you take these words and switch them out to mean other words, so if you read it prophetically, then it can say an entirely different sentence and be true that way too, which to me is just the most backward mental gymnastics I've ever seen. So I've got Dr. Joshua Bowen with me today, and he says he's gonna talk about a video that was made by one of these Christians, a guy named Mike Winger, who apparently had it in for me because I don't know that I stuck a pebble in his shoe or something. So he got upset that I said that his precious prophecies weren't fulfilled. And there's been a handful of Christians say, well, you got to go watch Mike Winger's video, as if I'm going to sit through an hour and a half each of those videos just to listen to somebody whose arguments, so far as I can tell, are going to be whittled down to nuh-uh, because that's what they usually are. Anyway, Dr. Bowen, what is, if I could just preface this already, because I'm curious about the doctor thing, what are you doctor of? What is your accolades here?
Sure. So, by the way, thank you, Arn, for having me on. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to, I don't know, put my 2 cents in here. So, I, interestingly enough, got my bachelor's degree from Liberty University. So, I was quite the evangelical fundamentalist Christian. Then I went and got a master's in theology from Capital Bible Seminary, another very conservative evangelical school. So I took and then taught Hebrew at the seminary. So I've taught 2 years of graduate level Hebrew. And then I was accepted to Johns Hopkins University, where I became an Assyriologist. So Assyriology is essentially studying cuneiform, primarily cuneiform, but it's ancient Mesopotamia. So the languages and cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, and Sumerian, Akkadian. This is what we primarily do. So I specialized in Sumerian. I minored in Hebrew Bible because I had such an extensive background in that, and I wrote my dissertation on Sumerian liturgical and literary texts, which was a lot of fun. But I suppose that background gives me, on the one hand, a very broad and I would say deep understanding of the ancient Near East in general, and more specifically, or as it applies to these types of conversations, I have an extensive background in Hebrew, and I've got 6 years of New Testament Greek under my belt, although I would not call myself a New Testament scholar. But I think that given that background, it allows me to get frustrated watching some of these videos. So that's how I initially got involved. And I'll stop talking, Aaron. Sorry. But I initially got involved in this because I started actually, Aaron, watching your videos first, I guess about, coming up on 10, 11 months ago. And I watched a video and then sent you an email and said, look, I have this background. If that could be of any use to you in these conversations, I'd be very happy to provide that. And we interacted a little bit, and then I went on an Non Sequitur show, and then we started our own channel, which is called Digital Hammurabi. So we have a YouTube channel. It's a YouTube channel dedicated to that. And so I watched, I actually came across Mike Winger's 2-part video series before I saw your Unfulfilled Prophecy video. And after about 30 minutes or so of watching the first video of his, I stopped and went and watched yours, and then went through the rest of his videos. And I think Mike is coming from a place it's a genuine place that he's coming from, and he's defending a position that I think, he truly believes. And I think he's been taught things. That's what I suspect, that he's been taught things that feel comfortable, that seem solid enough. And if you don't have the Hebrew background or the Akkadian background or any of these other things in the ancient Near East, it's difficult to really challenge those ideas in a real and a serious way. So I felt compelled to do that, and so I contacted you and said, what would you be interested in me presenting some of this information? So here we are.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. So I'm guessing by all of that there's a reasonably good chance that you've read the Bible
once or twice.
And so I don't know what any of this guy's counter arguments are, but I know that when I went through and I read, the first problem I had was in Matthew when it references Isaiah 7. And it says, that this is the fulfillment of that prophecy. And then I go back and I read that prophecy and I realize this is all jacked up. This is talking about a kid from 700 years earlier. This is clearly not talking about Jesus, right? And so how do people read it? Well, it seems that they just want to read in the way, however they want to read it in. It's like reading your astrology chart or a fortune cookie with these people. That's really the way I interpret it. So give me because I didn't hear any of his arguments. I've heard those kind of random excuses that people come up with. And for something like this, I couldn't even imagine that there would be anything of substance. And more importantly, I knew that if there was something of substance, that somebody within the skeptical community would notify me and say, hey, he's got a valid argument here, because we will eat our own if we make a mistake. That I've figured that out. It's like the believers may tell a bunch of lies to bolster each other's face. They may call themselves Judeo-Christian just to make themselves seem like an alliance, or they'll call it some big theistic alliance just to go up against us. But I know how the scientific community are. I know what pedantic nerds they are. And if somebody wants to make a video criticizing me, I don't need to see it, because my friends will tell me if somebody actually had something of substance that I need to address or account for. So what did you come across?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make. One of the things that I think I hear a lot as an academic, as a scholar, is that, the things that you're sort of indoctrinated in your own little echo chamber, right? You guys just kind of pull your own things together and you ignore evidence. And the problem with that, and of course you know this in the scientific community, the way that you get ahead is by proving other people wrong. That's what we long for, right? That's why you go to these conferences. I just got back from one. We go to these conferences and we pick apart the minutia. That's what we're trying to do, because we want to, actually, that's not right. It should be this way. And so this idea, I deal a lot on our channel with, unfortunately, because I do Sumerian, I have to deal with a lot of these ancient alien people. And so there's this idea that, well, we just cover it up. I can read the Sumerian texts, but I'm just covering it up because that's what academia wants to do. Yeah, I would love. My wife Megan is also an Assyriologist, and she's really the brains behind the technology and the cooler stuff on the channel. But she has said we would love to find out that they were aliens. Be the ones to discover that and prove it from the Sumerian, because we'd be famous and rich. That's how it works. So, I guess
money I would make if I just suddenly one day decided to find Jesus.
There you go. Yeah.
I could do the Lee Strobel. Well, I was a card-carrying atheist, and except that I could actually prove that I was.
Yeah. I catch a fair amount of flack because I was a pastor for 7 years, and now, in the position that I'm in, given the New Testament teaching on those that leave the faith. I was a Christian.
About that. I love deconversion stories, and I don't want to sidetrack at all. So,
Sure.
Is your deconversion story relevant to the discussion we're having now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some way. So, I've got a video up about this. If anybody's interested, it's an hour and a half of me talking about it. But so maybe that's not interesting. But I grew up as a Christian, an evangelical Christian, fundamentalist. The Bible was the inspired and inerrant Word of God down to the letters, grammatical forms. And I went to seminary. I became a pastor of an evangelical church. And then I went to Hopkins, and people will say, "Oh, well, there you go. You went to a liberal school," but that's not what it was. Before I taught at seminary for 2 years in the Old Testament department. I was an adjunct professor, and I remember my last week before
I gotta say, you were already reading cuneiform.
Right? Yeah, that's correct.
See, you've already gone beyond my threshold. Your faith has withstood more than I think mine could have.
But it didn't take long. But I remember the last week before I went in, somebody said, "Are you excited about going to Hopkins?" And I said, "I'm going." This is real. I said, "I'm going into the lion's den, but I am going to win souls to Christ." That's what I said. And then I had to take historical courses, right, that looked at the archaeological contexts. I had to read ancient Near Eastern literature in detail, and I had to interact with the wider cultural milieu. And I won't bore you with the details, but it didn't take half a semester, and I fought it. I really, really did, because, gosh, I've been a Christian for 30 years. But that's sort of what happens. And of course, now what I hear is that I really didn't believe all those years, the years that I was a pastor. Of course, I wasn't really a Christian. I was just telling myself that, which
there's got to be an excuse that will protect their faith.
That's exactly right. So the reason that I think that could be relevant here is that some of the things that I encountered are things like what you talked about in your video, right? So something like the Ezekiel 26 prophecy against Tyre, I think is actually a really important prophecy to talk about. And I can wait to get into that, because he's got it at the end of his video series as sort of the climax to it, the defense of Ezekiel 26. So I'll sort of hold off on that. But it's one of these things that it's a clear failure of failed prophecy, and it's not one that anybody really debates in the scholarly community. At Christian, unbeliever,
doesn't the Bible? This should have been an easy thing, because even in Jesus's time, they're still talking about the Tyrians, right? So obviously, there's still people there.
Yeah, and I think so. Here's what I struggle with in a broad sense when I interact on the YouTube channel with people that take this sort of broad, very loose approach to the text, right? One that they've started with their conclusion, and now they're trying to find evidence, to support that conclusion. And that is that the text becomes, in some ways, overly complex, and in other ways, unbelievably simplistic. And neither of those things are appropriate, particularly when you're studying an ancient text. So, they become overly complex, because, as we're going to see, for example, with the prophecy against Tyre, because you have to read into the pronouns, and you have to read into the shift. The metaphor of waves must mean, so it becomes.
Interpretation that I heard was that every time they mentioned a name, then it was this author, and it was talking about I forget the guy that was supposed to take it the first time.
Nebuchadnezzar.
Thank you. And then whenever it mentioned he or them, well, then it was referring to the other guy whose name I
Alexander.
can't remember from 100 years later. So I'm having senior moments
That's
occasionally.
fine.
But it just looked to me to be a very strained way to read the scripture. I mean, if God is writing this, why would he write it in such a convoluted way? As a matter of fact, if God existed, why would he be interested in any of this?
It is interesting. The Tyre prophecy, I think, is particularly interesting because 3 chapters later, Ezekiel sort of owns up that his prophecy didn't take place. Right? He says, "Oh, well, every head was rubbed, bald, and every shoulder was rubbed or rubbed raw or bare." As Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers went up, and they couldn't take it, right? And so they didn't get the plunder that they wanted to have. And so God's going to give them Egypt instead. So
And in that prophecy, right?
right, that one failed.
It was another one that failed. I mean, Ezekiel just failed prophecies.
Yeah. But see, this is the thing. This is not uncommon in the prophets, right? I mean, you see this in Isaiah. It's just they're less common, right? They're less well known. But this is why I say this is the overly simplistic approach. The overly simplistic approach is to say, "Oh my gosh, that prophecy failed. That means that it's a false prophet. Everything must fall apart with Christianity. All of these things." And I don't think that's the case. I'm not a Christian, but I don't think that your Christianity has to depend upon Tyre falling to Nebuchadnezzar. One of the things that's interesting about that prophecy, and I'm sorry, I'm not getting into any of the details of it. I will. It's one of the things that sort of validates the historicity of Ezekiel, right? Because that prophecy wasn't redacted, right? It's something that wasn't taken out, and it so clearly should have been, right? But it wasn't. So I think that there's this overly simplistic approach and this sort of grabbing onto these details to fight for them when there's really no need to, because ancient texts do things that if we don't understand the genres that existed during the period, if we don't understand the things that something like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is doing, then we're going to read them as scientific texts. We're going to read them as historical texts, and we're going to come away with things that the text wasn't intending to do, right? And I think that's really important. So, if you want, I'll sort of walk through. I tried to do this in a similar order to what Mike Winger did. And I won't go into all the details because you don't have time to do that, I'm quite certain. But I wanted to pick out some of the specific things. In the video, he accused you of something called dumping, which I thought was a very interesting term. And in part of the video, you said snakes and donkeys can't talk, whales aren't fish, bats aren't birds, ritual spells don't purify or cure illness, and striped sticks don't cause striped.
Don't cause cattle to bear striped cattle.
That's right. So he slowed that down, he said, and he picked it apart. And one of the things that I thought was kind of disingenuous about it is I felt like that was a somewhat rhetorical part of your video. That those weren't like heavy linchpins of yours. Now, that being said, I think that it's all true. For example, he camped for a little while on how many snakes talked? Just one. How many donkeys talked? Just one, and this was a supernatural thing.
And the excuse in both cases is that, God took over the donkey, as if that makes any sense.
Exactly.
Right.
I don't think, and that's the thing. You and I sitting here, I don't think either of us would say that the biblical text isn't representing that as a miracle. We're just saying that that's not how reality works, right? So
you're God, you're in command of all these things, and your biggest obsession is this guy at the moment, and you're going to talk through his ass.
So one of the things, I mean, again, if you approach these texts in a 21st century way, or in a way that's trying to justify an end conclusion, you're going to have to battle to read these texts this way, right? However, I have a friend named Skylar Fiction, and I go on his channel quite a lot. And we read through the biblical text and we just sort of look at what is this text doing? So we're about halfway through Genesis now. And whenever you ask that question, you often find that that the text is an etiological myth, right? It's trying to say, why is it that sin is in the world, right? Why do bad things happen? Well, let's give an Adam and Eve story, right? And that explains why that happened. And it also justifies God in that because he's not the one that did it. Imperfectly, I would say, but nonetheless. But on those things, one of the things that I wanted to camp on a little bit was this Jacob and Laban in Genesis 30 with the striped sticks, right? And he says that this is not a magical thing, and I just have to disagree, and mainstream scholarship will also disagree very strongly.
Well, even if it wasn't magical, I mean, I never saw that as being magical. I thought that this is the way people thought that worked.
Oh yeah, well that's so this was oh boy, I'm blanking on the term. Not empathetic magic.
Just wait till you get older; it happens more often.
Yeah, right. Well, I have MS, so it's like it's starting early, you know. But and it's sympathetic magic is what I'm shooting for. But so there's this argument that, well, maybe the rods, when you strip them down, they release some sort of toxin that caused them to bear. It's totally unnecessary to do that, and the Hebrew text doesn't bear it out, right? The emphasis in this text is that it's placed before their eyes. They mate in the midst of these sticks. They're facing the sticks. And that's the sympathetic magic, right? If you have sticks that are striped while they're having sex, then that will transfer sympathetically to the cat. But that's the point, is that the text, it goes to great lengths, I think, not to mention God as a factor here. Now it's attributed in the next chapter. Genesis is a very interestingly redacted book. But the point is that I think this is very clearly sympathetic magic. And I think you have to, as a Christian, you have to deal with that, because that was the thought of the time. As you said, this is what they believed, right? This is how they believed it worked.
And they wouldn't even have thought that it was necessarily magic. They just, I thought that they just would have thought that that's how that naturally worked.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many.
I mean, I've heard in my lifetime, I've heard people say that one woman said that her child, her baby, her infant baby, looked like Peter Lorre, and it's because she saw too many Peter Lorre movies the week before she gave birth. Right? Seriously?
Yeah. All right. Yeah, and that's I would say that's also a possibility. But I think the bigger point here is that this isn't how it works, right? And in that sense, if we're looking at this as a scientific text, the Bible is getting it wrong. Now, I would argue that that's not a scientific passage, right? It's an etiological myth that's trying to show something about the ancestors of Israel and trying to build an ancestry for the nation to give them validity. But if you read it the other way, I mean, you run into problems, as you're pointing out. Something else that you said that he took issue with is, you said anything that the Bible says about science is laughably wrong or in every case. Now, again, I think that was a rhetorical thing. I don't think that you would argue that nothing in the Bible is consistent with science. I
did say that everything that the Bible says about the earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos is laughably wrong.
Yeah, and there's no question about that. Now, he cited Job 36 with the water cycle, and the fact that Genesis 1 seems to say that the earth began. I mean, that the universe began. I mean, that's pretty.
I like how creationists will argue using the Big Bang as their proof that the universe had a beginning, but then argue against the Big Bang.
Yeah.
But that's the proof that we had a beginning.
Yeah. Well, my response to that while I was driving in my vehicle was, well, let's talk about the flat earth. Let's talk about the Bible's representation of cosmic geography. And I won't go through these. I do research. It's sort of what I do. But this wasn't much research. It was just what's there very clearly. the earth has a firmament that goes over top of it, right? And it's a hammered out plate, essentially, right? It's something solid.
It's supposed to be molten glass.
That's exactly right. And in creation in Genesis 1, that plate is essentially placed in the middle of the primordial waters and pulls up some of the water to keep it above the firmament, right? The earth is flat. It's clearly flat. I don't need to go into I'll probably make a video about this. Actually, I think I'm going on the Non Sequitur show to talk about this in more detail.
I've heard writings of people in the Middle Ages, of religious leaders in the Middle Ages, and when one person said that he didn't believe that they were what he called antipodes, and that's people on the other side of the flat Earth. Because if somehow you could get to the other side, if there was a mirror side of Earth,
right,
or on the other, maybe even if it was a globe, if you had people on the other side of Earth, then they would have had to have had their own Jesus and their own crucifixion, all that whole. What exactly is separating these two hemispheres in his mind? I have no idea.
But see, this is the thing, and I'm having a small conversation with Hugh Ross on Twitter, and the one of the things that I said to him was, you have to read these texts respecting their genre. It's the critical thing to do when reading ancient texts, and so few people do it. And so when you look at something like the Bible's representation of cosmic geography, it's perfectly in line with the rest of the ancient Near East. This is what they thought, right? You read the Enuma Elish and you see Marduk slicing Tiamat in half and taking half of her body and stretching it out like a tent, just like it says in the biblical text, stretching out the heavens like a tent. And then using the other half of her body to create, the earth, the way that the universe is structured, the universe being, this earth and the firmament and what's the third heaven and those sorts of things, is structured very, very similarly to the way that the Israelites viewed it, in the 5th century when they wrote this stuff. So,
and the Persians and the Chinese, and it was a common belief throughout Asia, so far as I can tell.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's nothing, like, nobody should walk away from this going, oh my gosh, how could the Bible get it so wrong? It should be, how did the Bible get it just like everybody else did? I mean, and that's not a surprise. So then it moved on to, and feel free to stop me at any time.
No, I'm interested to hear.
So it moved on to Isaiah 53, which I think that and Psalm 22 are the last two things talked about in his first video. And there was a discussion about who the servant is. Now, this is a place where I think everybody's got to come to the realization that this is one of those places where the text is, it's clear and it's not, right? And the interpretations of those passages of the four servant songs, they're many and varied, right? This he makes the argument that the servant in Isaiah 52:13, 53:12, I'll just call it Isaiah 53, that servant is Israel is a very late, it's very late. It's a very modern idea. Well, I mean, it's simply not true. So, the 2nd century Septuagint reading argues it goes to great lengths to translate the servants, particularly the servant in Isaiah 53, as Israel.
About the passage where we're describing Israel as a people, right? As a collective, that's supposed to be the suffering servant.
That's correct. So there were several things here that kind of jumped out at me, and I was going to go into great detail about the text, but I think that might be boring. But there are two things that I think stand out. Number one, modern scholarship, the consensus scholarship here is that Cyrus is the servant in chapter 42. That the I think remaining 8 references, I can't remember. Actually wrote it down here. Yeah, the 12 other uses in 40 to 48 refer to Israel and Jacob. The servant is the nation of Israel. And then when you come to Isaiah 53, I think that Deutero-Isaiah, right, the guy that we think probably penned second Isaiah here, is acting as a representative of the nation, right? And I don't think there's any real problem with that, because this is all part of apocalyptic messianic genre, right? This is what they do. There's this, if you read through the book of Daniel, for example, I mean, you see this this concept of suffering that has to take place, unjustifiable suffering that has to take place, because this is being born out of their suffering during the 2nd century. Right? I mean, this is directly related to this. And they pick up on these themes. So I don't think there's any problem in seeing if we want to talk about authorial intent, seeing Isaiah 53 as an individual, probably Deutero-Isaiah himself, the guy writing this thing, acting as not him writing it, but probably his followers later writing it about him because he died. But representing Israel as a whole, right? So in that sense, you can see how, a late 1st century, early 2nd century author could come back to this and say, "Oh my gosh, this is messianic," because it's part of the messianic milieu. It's part of this messianic idea. But seeing with specificity this idea, for example. Well, I guess we can probably talk about that. That's going to be too detailed. But I think that he makes the statement that Jesus, the passage doesn't say that Jesus, that the servant was beaten by God, right? And he says, no, we accounted him as smitten by God, as beaten by God. Well, verse 6 and verse 10 clearly say that God is the one. He's the agent doing the smiting. He's the one doing the crushing. So there are particulars about this that I think he just gets wrong, but it's in defense of a position that I don't think he needs to have. I don't think the way that the New Testament authors use Old Testament prophecy often doesn't line up with their Old Testament contexts, and they were okay with that. It wasn't a problem for them, because that type of usage in the New Testament's fine. They have different concepts about keeping things. We would have a problem taking something out of context, right? That wasn't necessarily the case for them. So, like, moving on to, and I know I'm moving quickly, and I'm sorry about that.
That's quite all right. But if I could interject, but
sure.
It might take things out of order. I mean, there was the reference to, I think it was King David talking about how he's being hunted by hounds. He's got, people are bringing their dogs out to chase him down, and there's a line in there where, depending on your translation, it could say piercing your hands and feet. If you're being hunted by dogs and they're snapping at you, how is that a reference to Jesus? Obviously, the guy got his hand bit by a dog. That's what I'm reading.
So, the Psalms are obviously very, very poetic, very metaphorical. And David is describing, the psalmist is describing despair that he's feeling. I mean, this is what they do in the Psalms. So metaphor is, it's just huge. The problem with that passage is that verb that you just talked about, that form, the piercing. There's an article here that the Journal of Biblical Literature that in 2004 by Kristen Swenson, and it's just one that you can peruse. She does a pretty good job summarizing all of the different ways that scholars have tried to. That verb doesn't make sense in the context to pierce, right? It's weird. It's a verb. There's a very common Hebrew verb to pierce. And by the way, when it says pierce, it doesn't mean to, like, of course, when we think of pierce, we think pierce, the hands, right? But if you read the uses of the word pierce, and again, it's this other very common verb, it means to, like, kill somebody, right, to drive something through them, to stab them, to kill them.
Run through or something along those lines.
Huh?
Stab.
Yeah, to stab. That's right. So she goes through. So Mike Winger takes this and says, well, it's very clear in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they translate this as pierced. Well, the versions are actually very divided, extremely divided. When you look at the Old Greek, when you look at the later redactions, when you look at the Targums, it's not clear at all. And actually, and I won't go. I won't bore the listeners with all the different ways that this could be translated. But she comes down, and I think it's it's a reasonable. It's something reasonable to say. She wants the verb just before this weird form in the Masoretic text, which reads like a lion. You referenced that in your video. She reads the verb before it with that like a lion. So like a lion, they have surrounded my hands and my feet. And what she says here, and again, I'm not saying that this is the correct translation. What I'm trying to say is that it's very complicated. And so making a statement that it's, oh, well, the Greek says it, so that must mean what it, be what it means, it's naive, unfortunately. So she says here, the word guides readers to imagine both the encircling of dogs and lions before they attack, and the condition of the psalmist paralyzed with fear and unable either to defend himself or herself or to run away. It describes both spatial circling and figurative cutting off of options. The psalmist's enemies, likened to a pack of dogs and to a lion, figuratively circle around him or her. The terror of the threat has effectively cut off the psalmist's strengths, yadai, my hands, my power, and the ability to flee, raglai, my feet. Right. So you can see that it's metaphorical, but it's like the psalmist saying, "Day and night my tears have been my food." Right. It's a type of poetic imagery that's driving home the point. So I think it's much more complicated than that. And I think trying to pigeonhole because of an interpretation that you want it to say something, because the New Testament author seems to allude to it, and in Mark or in Matthew, I just think it's too simplistic of an approach.
So every time that I'd get into an argument with a Christian, like when in my youth, like before the days of the internet, you just look up things in a moment, before I had, when all you could do is like, you have a Bible and you can sift through that, but what the hell are you going to understand? Because you kind of have to, and I already know this with the Quran. I mean, the Bible taught me that if I get a copy of the Quran and I read the Quran, that's not going to help me. I'm going to have to study what they believe about the Quran, because just like with the Bible, when it says this, it means that. So all the way through it. So it's very frustrating. And now I forgot where I was going to go with that. Oh man, I wish I could remember now. Oh well, I sidetracked myself.
No, I mean, and I think that's a good point, because if you let the text speak for itself.
Oh, I remember what it was.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
They would always hit me up with these prophecies. Well, there's all these prophecies, like hundreds of prophecies that have been fulfilled in the Bible. And I'm thinking that they would be somewhat better than the quatrains of Nostradamus. I'm expecting that there's going to be actual, things that happen, on this date to this country, whatever. And okay, now I get the symbolism that there would be the bear, the dragon, and the eagle. Okay, well I can get USSR and China and the United States. I can see those things. And the lion, of course, that's England, right? It's so easy to draw these, draw these kind of symbols and then try to read it that way. But the thing is, when you get any of the actual prophecies and read them, they're not.
And when they're specific, they often just don't come true.
Yeah. The only prophecy the first prophecy that I ever looked at was the one where Jesus himself said that some of you standing here will not even taste of death. Now he said some of them. That means something very different if he'd said none of them. And all the interpretations that I give, all the excuses that I've heard for how it didn't really mean that some of them would be that some of them would be dead in the body, and that others would still be alive in the body. They'll be, well, he'd be dead in the spirit. Well, how, only some of them?
And that's actually the passage that he goes to next, and it's, I think, one that we need to deal with, because what he argues, you talk about Matthew 24. This generation, some of you that are standing here, the different gospels, have it worded slightly differently. Will not taste death until the see the kingdom, right? So, and again, this is something that's it's very clear in the text, right? Well, he argues that, well, if you look back in some of the gospels, some of those passages are followed by the transfiguration of Jesus, right? So where Jesus takes his people up on some of his disciples up on the mountain, and he changes and he transforms, and this is him in his kingdom, right? He's showing them his power.
So he's telling these guys that some of you will still be alive Sunday.
Yep. Yep. The problem, and again, this is one of these things that if you're taking a particular view of the text as a whole, right, and you're interpreting the Bible in this framework, when you come up against these difficulties, you have to somehow figure out a way to make them work, right? The problem with this one in particular is that in Matthew 24 and in Mark 13, where he's talking about this, and this is not my opinion, right? I would not consider myself a New Testament scholar. I have, like the Yale Bible Commentary series that I just went and perused.
Old Testament.
Yeah. But one of the things that's it's common scholarship, it's mainstream scholarship, Christian, agnostic, whatever. These people are coming to the text and dealing with what the text says and what they say. I mean, you look at Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is saying, Mark 13 is saying, this generation will not pass. It's you people, right? This generation, they're expecting maybe within 40 years, which fits with the time, right? The destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which is probably when these texts were all written, well, at least Mark.
So the prophecies were written about the event that had just happened. And
that's correct.
Backdated.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, I would say that's probably. I want to be careful about what I say about New Testament stuff, because I feel like I'm moving slightly out of my field. But yes, I mean, I think that's mainstream scholarship. But there is no transfiguration after Matthew 24. There's no transfiguration after Mark 13. Right? These are clearly passages that are describing, and I typed all of these notes out. These things that are going to take place are clearly the parousia, right? They're the eschatological things. Remember, you were talking about in your video, you'll hear about wars and rumors of wars, famines and all these things. Mike Winger says, well, what that means is these things will happen, but the end is not yet. So that means that these things are going to happen, but the end is still way off, right? The problem is that that's not.
You're going to recognize that the time was nigh.
That is exactly right. I mean, that's really, I think, unfair to try to impose upon the text, and particularly the metaphors that are given about a sapling and, the figs are going to fall. I just think that's extraordinarily problematic. Okay. So the big thing that he talked about, and that I wrote a paper on specifically for this, it's called Tired of Hearing About Tyre, is this prophecy in Ezekiel 26. And I obviously want that. I mean, see, this is the thing about this sort of stuff. It's up on our Patreon. I'm going to do a video where I'm probably just going to read it, but in an interesting way. I won't just read it.
No, just like that.
But the funny thing about this is, I obviously have a lot of academic friends, and we're nerdy. I sent one. I always want to at least peer review with one other scholar when I do even popular level stuff like this. So I sent it to my friend, Dr. William Reed, who's a Hebrew Bible specialist from Johns Hopkins. And I said, hey, just read this thing. And it seems so, it's honestly, it seems so elementary, but just read it. And he wrote back, and the first line of his email was, "Is this debated?" I mean, it's like, I'm sorry, are there people that think that the Ezekiel prophecy didn't fail? I mean, like, do you have to write a paper about this? And I don't mean that to be like, I'm not trying to be mean. Um, it's just, if you take that position, you're clearly trying to do something that the text is not trying to do. So basically, in this, I'll just run through his basic argument, and then the counter to that argument. So the prophecy in Ezekiel 26, these are his two pillars, right? The prophecy in Ezekiel 26, and maybe I should just set the stage. So Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has come up and he's destroyed Jerusalem, right? And then he turns his attentions to Tyre. Now, Tyre is part of the coastline. It's a very strategic part in all of the ancient Near East, because there's a communication line that runs through there. Your troops oftentimes have to go through there, and so it's very important to get the coastline and even that island city of Tyre, right? But it's very important to have that mainland strip, right, at least under your control to a certain degree, because they could really cause problems for you. So Nebuchadnezzar's going up against the island city of Tyre. The text is very, very clear that it's the island city of Tyre. It's not the mainland city of Ushu, which are
the sisters on the mainland.
That's right. That is exactly right.
Daughters on the mainland.
The daughters on the mainland, right? Now Ushu is called Old Tyre in some texts, and so he's well, anyway. So Nebuchadnezzar's going up against it. Ezekiel sees this, right? He's seen Jerusalem get destroyed, and now he's watching, this stuff go up, this army go up, this massive army of Nebuchadnezzar's go up to Tyre, and his conclusion is Tyre is going to get its ass handed to it, right? So he prophesies against it. He's going to, besiege the city. He's going to knock down the walls, and blah blah blah. And to the point that it says it's going to, scrape it bare, throw all the debris into the water. The water the deep is going to come up over it, and it will be no more.
What he did was he wrote the election prediction that Hillary was going to win, and then never erased it the next day.
That is a really good analogy. That is a really good analogy. But this is the way prophecy works, right? And it's not just biblical prophecy. We have prophecies from all over the ancient Near East. Anyway, so what his argument is that the prophecy in Ezekiel 26 speaks of many nations. So it says in the first couple of verses, I can't remember which one, it's probably like 3. It says, I am sending against you many nations, right? And they will come against you as the waves of the sea. And he says, aha, it's not just going to be Nebuchadnezzar, right? Which sounds legitimate, right? I'm not going to say that doesn't sound legitimate. And he bolsters this by a shift in the pronoun, as you mentioned earlier, from he to they in 26:12. So it says, he, and then it switches to they in verse 12. So he says, that's Alexander the Great. So that's pillar number 1. Pillar number 2 is Nebuchadnezzar did lay siege to Tyre. So even if you say that Nebuchadnezzar is the first one and then Alexander is the second one, the stuff that's in that passage, and by the way, you can't say that Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the one that was supposed to do all of it. I'll prove that in a minute. But even if you do grant that, Nebuchadnezzar does a whole bunch of really bad stuff to Tyre, right? He's got to break in and go through the streets and trample it down. I mean, he's got to do a lot of stuff. He's got to get in.
Knock down the walls, and then the island is supposed to sink into the sea and be lost forever, an unrecognizable bare rock.
Yep.
To spread
spreading of nets. Yep. Well, what he argues is that Nebuchadnezzar did lay siege to Tyre, but it was old Tyre, the mainland city of Ushu. And then he laid siege to that for 13 years. And during that siege, and if you picture how this is structured, you've got old Ushu, old Tyre, whatever, and then some mainland, and then 600 yards or whatever of water, and then the island city. What he argues is he laid siege over here, left all of this open for some reason, and then during the 13-year siege, they were sneaking out, I guess, going to the island city. So after 13 years, Nebuchadnezzar does break in, and he walks around and goes, oh, everybody's gone from the mainland city. So the prophecy was fulfilled because he broke into the mainland city. So those are the two pillars, right? Many nations, Nebuchadnezzar's one, Alexander's later. This is bolstered by the pronoun he to they. And then Nebuchadnezzar did lay siege to Tyre, but it was old Tyre, the mainland city of Ushu. And by the time he broke in, they'd relocated. Lots of problems.
I want Syrians to build my next house if it can have an army beat their heads against the wall for 13 damn years.
They're just, it's historic. Well, anyway, so yeah, I agree. So first, Nebuchadnezzar is the only agent of God spoken of in the text, period. And I'll deal with the they here in a minute.
Bring up the Muslims in the 1300s and all of that, because I've heard that was another Christian interpretation. How many different people have over the millennia have waged war in this area, and so they're just like adding them all to the list.
Maybe he did, but I don't remember. I don't remember it in saying that.
When Nebuchadnezzar was supposed to take it, it was never supposed to have power again.
Right.
And yet they were reestablished immediately. They were at war again within what, a year?
Yeah, I mean, it's the only thing that happened with Nebuchadnezzar, we think, is that the king of the city essentially was taken, right? But the city itself was, I mean, they weren't fine, right? They'd been under siege for 13 years, but
but Mike Winger wants to argue that Ezekiel is not just some guy talking out of his ass, because I mean, everybody that wrote the Bible was just a guy writing stuff. And then, other people decided which books are going to be included and which ones aren't, and which ones, like, you know what, I like this version better, let's add this. Or, we can't have these commandments, we have to have these other set of commandments. Why not have both? Because that's what it looks like to me, that this thing was set. That's the way this thing was set up.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that I've got a whole series on the channel about textual criticism, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we did an interview with Dr. William Reed, actually, about the Deuteronomistic history. So, like, this major section of the Old Testament and how it was redacted and pieced together, right? And when that might have happened and how the circumstances for it. Yeah, it's a very complicated editorial history. So Nebuchadnezzar is the only agent spoken of in the text, and that the problem here is that the text says this many nations. So how do we deal with this many nations? Well, the text says in verse 7, "For thus says the Lord God, I am bringing to Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, from the north, the King of Kings," which is it's Melech Melachim. It's a phrase that's actually probably a play on the Akkadian. It's King of Kings. I mean, you hear it just in the English, with horse, with chariot, with horsemen, and with a host, and Rav. That doesn't mean anything if you don't know Hebrew, but Rav means many or great, right? So when it says many nations, back in verse 3 or whatever it is, it's goyim rabim. So the goyim, if you know that term, the nations, many nations. Well, this is,
we don't have Jews here, so I don't.
Right. This is rav. So it's the same adjective. This has led. I think this is just the normal conclusion that people come to, that this host, this many people, probably made up of Chaldeans, whatever. This is the host, the many nations that's being referred to, right?
And they were all supposed to be a combined effort led by the King of Kings.
That's correct. That's correct. Which, again, this is the way that these texts are constructed, right? This is how they work. So I say here the adjective many in verse 3 is the same adjective used in verse 7, rav. So this has led Daniel Block, who is eminent scholar in. He's got a fantastic commentary on the book of Ezekiel. He says the Goyim Rabim portrayed as waves beating on the rock in verse 3 are identified as Nebuchadnezzar with his title Melech Melachim and his hosts referred to as Kahal Wa'amrav, right? So this is not my interpretation, right? In other words, I completely agree with what he's saying. It's what I consider to be the natural reading of the text. But I think it's important to show that this is sort of the mainstream view. And of course, Daniel Block isn't the only one that holds to that. And I note here, you can see Ezekiel 30, verse 11, and Jeremiah 21, 4-10 for other examples of the Babylonian army depicted with general plurality, right? This is a sort of the way that this is written. Sorry, this is getting a little technical. So I think right off the bat, you don't have to hold to this many nations being anybody other than Nebuchadnezzar. But certainly this pronoun shift from he to they is just nonsense. So there are other prophetic passages that are constructed with similar shifts in pronouns. For example, Jeremiah chapter 20. For thus says the Lord, behold, I am going to make you a terror to yourself and to all your friends. And while your eyes look on, they will fall by the sword of their enemies, plural. So shall I give over all Judah to the hand of the king of Babylon, singular. And he will carry them away as exiles to Babylon, and he will slay them with the sword. Then the text continues, I shall also give over all the wealth of this city, all its produce, all its costly things, even all the treasures of the kings of Judah. I shall give over to the hand of their enemies, plural, and they, plural, will plunder them, take them away, and bring them to Babylon. So this pronoun shift, it's just a feature of the text, right? You're shifting perspective from the king singular or the nation singular to the army, the people that make up the army. And that's exactly what's going on here. So this shift in verse 12 is a shift to the soldiers, right? I cite Greenberg here, Moshe Greenberg. He addresses this shift to the third person. He says, quote, they, Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers. The shifts in subject portray the action from different viewpoints. In G, which is the Greek, all the verbs, and this is really important, in this verse are singular, continuing the person of the previous verb. In other words, just to sort of put this back into more simplistic terms, Mike Winger is saying the many nations, that's Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander, if there are other nations that he talks about later, that's who the many nations are. I think we can straight away do away with that, given the way that the text identifies Nebuchadnezzar and his army. Then he says you can see this played out in verse 12, where it shifts. They've been using the word he will do this, he, Nebuchadnezzar, will do this. Then in verse 12, it says they will plunder you, they will spoil. And Greenberg says, and again, it's just, I don't want to say common sense, but it's the natural reading of the text. The they there refers to the soldiers who are going in. And the way that he identifies this or supports this is if you look at the Greek translation of this in the Septuagint, they don't switch to the third person they. They continue to say the singular he. So if, in fact, this they was supposed to represent these later nations, which not only linguistically, syntactically, even poetically here, disrupts the flow of the chapter immensely. The Septuagint, who's translating this, doesn't see it that way and continues on with the use of the singular. So I think those are two really good answers to his two main objections in this first part. I don't know if that made sense.
It did to me.
Okay, very good.
Yeah, I don't know if the listener or if anybody watching this is necessarily following along. I would like to take, when this says uploaded, I'd like to take a link to this and put it on my Unfulfilled Prophecies video, so and make a reference. If you watch Mike, if you want to tell me to go watch Mike Winger's video, watch this first. And that'll maybe get some of these people to shut up. But I wanted to know, are there any prophecies that he came to the defense of where, in your opinion, there's any that you would have to give him the benefit of the doubt? I mean, did he defend any of them?
So it's sort of a complicated question in that, in order to say yes, I have to assume that these are supernatural prophecies, and I don't
necessarily. I mean, if you have a reading of the Bible where it implies that something is supposed to happen by a certain time or whatever, well, I guess the prophecies never do by a certain time, do they? I mean, is there anything that he put in that let me phrase the question a different way. Did I get anything wrong?
No, I mean, I think that probably if we nail down Isaiah 53, it's probably referring to the writer as an individual who is representing the nation, who is suffering for the nation, but he's representing the nation of Israel. So you can't. It's difficult to distinguish. Let me say it this way. Clearly, leading up to all of the servant songs, I mean, they say explicitly, Israel, Jacob, Israel, Jacob. I mean, there's no question about it. I don't think anybody doubts that. And the Septuagint translators took Isaiah 53 as a collective. They took it as representing the nation. I don't think, me personally, I would say that I think that there's a shift in 53 to an individual representative, but it's the guy that they're talking about in the period, in the same way that Isaiah 7 is talking about that kid, right? I mean, it's not assigned to Ahaz if it's not that kid, right? I mean, like, so if you're going to, here's what I will say. I don't see any specific prophecy like something in Ezekiel 26 that would lead me in any way to believe that these are supernatural predictions that are not inference. But even Ezekiel 26 wouldn't be.
If you were reading a fortune cookie or an astrology chart, I mean, did any of the things that was in there, could any of them justifiably be said to have come true? I mean, the only one that people have ever been able to cite for me that as a prophecy that came true was that Israel was made a nation, and it was like, okay, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They did it on purpose.
I think that's silly. Yeah, I think that's silly because it assumes facts not in evidence, right? It's assuming that you have to assume that these prophecies are not written for their specific time period. Right. So when Jesus says
something like 53 generations of people, and it was actually more than that, I think it was more than 100 generations, wasn't it?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. And this is the thing. If you're going to, I think it's an unfair interpretation. It's an unfair framework to place upon the text, right? In order to read it this way, in order to manipulate what Jesus is saying so that he's not saying something wrong in Matthew 24 or Mark 13, to manipulate his words to say, well, it's not really what generation means there, right? Or he's really talking about the transfiguration. I think you have to let the text stand and then say, okay, that's what it says. That's what it meant. What does that mean, right? So maybe we have to shift away from Jesus actually saying these things in 33, right? And shift it to Mark, or whoever wrote Mark, or Q, or whatever, who's putting the words in Jesus' mouth. Was there a person named Jesus? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not a first century historian, but if there was, is it okay for Christianity as a whole? If you've got people 100 years later, writing things referring to Jesus. I mean, you have it in the Old Testament all the time. You have it in Daniel. You have it in Kohelet in the book of Ecclesiastes. These things are just, nobody disputes that. Nobody in academia disputes these things, right? Because it's just abundantly clear. And so I think trying to come at a text and say this was meant to have this open-ended prophecy, which what you would have to say is you would have to say Isaiah 7:14 did mean that woman and her child. It did mean that, but it also meant Jesus way down the road.
And that's the argument that I heard.
That's right. And
the story with that kid, and that it somehow also refers to Jesus.
if you're going to do that, I think you have to own that it's a faith-based. I mean, you're not going to be able to come to that text and say, here's evidence for that, right? And what I think you have to do is face these other prophecies that are relatively specific, that do not come true.
Yeah, like the one we talked about with Ezekiel, where he said that Egypt would be a barren wasteland for 40 years. And unlike all these other prophecies, that one had a time limit. It was supposed to be under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So we know that one failed. It's not something that people can put off to the future after, well, maybe after the Third World War, maybe it'll be like that, because we know when it was supposed to be like that. And when people like what the reference to David being surrounded by the dogs and all that, and I could understand that was prophecy. He's obviously not talking about that he was really, really stalked by all these things. I got that it was a metaphor, but if you read the line where somebody uses the word pierce as the translation, well, suddenly that one sentence is a prophecy to Jesus. Really, that one sentence out of the whole story? All of it is about David except that one sentence, and that's about Jesus? How do you worship a God who writes this way?
Well, see, and I think this is the issue, right? Psalm 22 is quoted. It's at least alluded to fairly extensively in the crucifixion stories, right? So, casting lots for the garment sorry, I'm trying to remember other aspects of the passage, but that's the one that stands out to me. So it's alluded to. Psalm 22, I think, is definitely alluded to, and I don't think there's any question about that. The issue is, which way does that allusion go, right? Are we saying this? To me, it's a little silly, right? We can read this one of two ways. We can have a later author who knows these texts like the back of their hand, right? Who knows these texts very well. Jesus on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, or in the Hebrew, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. He knows this passage. My God, why have you forsaken me? Right? I mean, and so, even if Jesus did say this on the cross, even if there was a Jesus, and that Jesus did die on a cross, and that Jesus did say these words, which I think, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. It's not like he didn't know this passage, right? Or that the writer who's, much more likely, the writer who's penning this and putting these words in Jesus' mouth knows these texts, knows them very well. I mean, they're part of their culture. They're part of their literature. And I think that it's just, so if you have the possibility that you have a later author who knows these texts very well, constructing a story, referring to all of these things back here that they know very well, and you say that's less likely than the people back here are writing these things, and then they just all come true here without any real connection to that, I think is silly, frankly. I
have a thought on the mythicism idea that the Jesus character, that we have this mythological character who you have real people, and his life story is actually stapled onto one or more of them. And I think it's interesting that when I get into it with Christians, and they'll mention, the reference to James, the brother of Jesus, the anointed, right? They're not even aware of why that's the wrong Jesus. but they insist that's their Jesus. Well, how often did that happen?
Hmm.
And then you have like in Luke's version of the crucifixion seems to be on the other side of Josephus writing the same thing, and they're contemporary,
Hmm.
right? So I mean, so Jesus Bar Matthias becomes Joseph of Arimathea, and really they're writing about the same event, but it's not Jesus. It's completely different people.
Hmm.
And then you just sort of have the mythological character attached to that. And the reason that I say that, and I don't mean to detract this at all, but
No.
I already did, so I'm not going to apologize, is that I have this issue with like Justin Martyr. I misread Justin Martyr for the longest time. I mean, I understood when he talked about how Satan made all of these other pagan characters seem like Jesus, and have all the pagan characters match Jesus's story to deceive us all. And all this time I was thinking he's talking about Satan going back in time and retroactively doing this. And then I realized that nobody had ever thought about time travel. Nobody had ever written about time travel at this time. He's not talking about Satan going back in time. And when I realized he made the reference to Jesus being uh, running his race like Hercules with what was it? Running his race, carrying the sun across the sky. He's referencing Psalm 19, right? He thinks Jesus's entire story, not Jesus's, I am before your fathers, I am, not that. He thinks Jesus's crucifixion, his entire passion story and everything, happened before Hercules, before Dionysus.
Hmm.
Now, this is a guy who lived at a time and place where he could have met people who had met Jesus. And yet he thinks Jesus lived thousands of years ago.
Hmm.
How could that be if he's a early second century church father? How is that possible? And so that's when I started realizing that you have a handful of Jesusii, as I like to call them. Like there's like 3 or 4 of them. And Josephus talked about 19 of them, but you've got 3 of them that the Christians often point to as being their guy, and we know that none of them are their guy. So that's kind of where I come to my mythicism from. It's just the way that these stories are being pieced together, and you're only making this more concrete in talking about the way that these people piece these stories together. As I just have a difficult time thinking that there was ever one guy who met all the criteria to be the Jesus character. I have the feeling that if you had a time machine and could go back to this time, that you would never find somebody you would recognize as Jesus. And even if you could find the 3 or 4 people that the story is based on that actually lived, you bring them forward in time and have them all watch Jesus Christ Superstar, and none of them will realize that that movie is about them.
Right. I mean, we see this sort of thing. I mean, this is how legends are developed, right? So, taking this sort of out of something that's really controversial, like Jesus, and putting into something that's not really all that controversial, like Gilgamesh, right? Gilgamesh probably was a guy, right? He was probably a king. We seem to have some. Yeah, I mean, we seem to have some evidence for him.
Does that mean that all of the stories, the love story with Enkidu and all that?
Yeah, I mean, it's. But
was there
of course not, right? Yeah, I mean, but that's the point. And I think any Christian hearing this, any evangelical Christian hearing this, or fundamentalist Christian, I don't want to say evangelical, but fundamentalist Christian would say, well, yeah, of course there was no Enkidu. Of course they didn't. Gilgamesh didn't outrun Shamash through the. Of course he didn't do that. Of course they didn't. Ishtar didn't propose to him, and he spurned her and then killed her bull of heaven and threw a fire at her.
Actually met Ziusudra face to face.
I mean, nobody would have any problem with that. But you see this. People have a tremendous problem with something like Daniel, right? You have this. There's this idea of a Daniel, a wise, courtier. There's these stories, these ideas about this, and it floats around 6th century, 5th century BCE, and so when you come to the 2nd century and you have Daniel being penned, and this text is attributed to him, or the stories are attributed to him, these are stories that are developed around this sort of idea of Daniel, right? And was there a Daniel? Maybe. I mean,
what I think there was? I think there was a John the Baptist. because I mean, there was a profound story about him, and he got so popular that they wanted to make another version and they make Jesus the new John the Baptist, but that meant that John the Baptist had to pass his torch over to Jesus.
Hmm.
And so the storytellers had to create a story where John the Baptist baptizes Jesus and then bestows onto Jesus, you are the new subject of the story.
Hmm.
And I mean, how many times have we seen that done before?
Hmm. I guess kind of bringing this all to prophecy.
Oh, hold on. I
Wait,
remember the Muslims did the same thing with Jesus. So I don't remember which book it was, but there was a story about Jesus. He's still alive now, and he comes out of his house every day and he goes and heals people every day. So he never died. He was never crucified. Jesus is still alive centuries later, and he's healing people every day. And somebody came to visit him around 1200 or something like that, and he was happy to have met Jesus. And Jesus says, "Well, I am not the final prophet, the prophet you need to see." So Jesus is referring people to Muhammad the same way that John the Baptist referred people to Jesus.
right,
Yeah.
nice,
So it's appropriation.
yeah. I think that at the end of the day, what we have to, I have no problem, obviously, with people being Christians, right? I have no problem with that. But I think when you come as a person who deals with ancient literature, right, ancient linguistics, I think it's unfair to come to these texts that are doing very specific things and to try to make them do other things that they're not intended to do. And I take issue with that, right? So I wanted to say there's the, I can just put the paper up. There was the second part of the tire prophecy, and I think this is something that's, I'll quickly go through it.
I'd be interested in the publication. You said you're going to put that up on your
Yeah, you know what? That's just what I'll do. There's a whole second part to it, and maybe that'll be just
on this video.
Yeah,
I'd like to include links to that
Yeah.
when you finally get it up.
Yeah, that's what we'll just do that. I'll just put it up there. But there's a whole second section to that, and I think it's even more conclusive than the first part.
Did I understand that you were going to have a debate with Mike Winger?
Yeah, no, so what ended up happening was we emailed, and I started putting this presentation together. Well, then I emailed Skylar. I tweet with Skylar Fiction all the time, and I said to him, "Hey, I'm getting ready to have this thing with R and Ra. We're gonna kind of pick apart Mike Winger's videos." And he said, "That's really cool. He's actually coming on my show." I said, "Oh, that's awesome." Well, I go on his show as like a co-host a lot. I have recently, anyway, past maybe a month or so. So I was going to be on there. I was probably going to say a couple of things if things got really crazy, but I don't know. I wasn't really planning on saying much. Skylar doesn't actually need my help, and he definitely didn't when that debate happened. But because I was talking about this paper and I was kind of talking about it cryptically, because I wanted it to go up on my Patreon and for people to be enticed to go on the Patreon and donate and then get it. Mike took that as we're getting ready to ambush him or something on Skylar's channel. So he said, I'm not going. And I don't blame him for that, right? That makes sense. So Skylar came out, said, "Hey, I've talked to Josh. He's not going to come on the show. Not going to be any problems." And then Mike did come on, so everything was fine. And as a matter of fact, Mike called me out in that debate a couple of times.
Wait. He backed out because you were going to be there, and then when you weren't going to be there, he came in and called you out.
That's right. And I don't. I'm okay with that.
I hear that. You know what that sounds like to me.
Well,
I won't express it in words.
I think that I was trying to be, I don't know, because of all the contention and the confusion, whatever. I actually stayed out of the live chat as well. But then so as Mike was leaving the debate, he said, "I guess Dr. Bowen has this paper that he's written about Tyre, and he's keeping it a secret from everybody. I can't wait to see it." Well, Skylar sent me a link to come into the Google Hangout, and I said, it's not a secret. It's up on our Patreon. I'm trying to get people to donate to the Patreon. We have a scholarship that we do. All the money that gets donated to our Patreon goes to a scholarship to fund a PhD student to go do a summer internship. We're providing 25
below.
Oh, okay, perfect. We've almost raised the $2,500 too, so it's pretty cool. But anyway,
$2,500. You're trying to raise $2,500.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear that, as I've seen people do their Patreon or do whatever their GoFundMe's are always in the thousands of dollars, and so often they're for the most trivial things.
Well, what we did is we said, so when we started this channel, the whole point was to try to make the ancient world, the ancient Near East, this biblical stuff palatable, right? Accessible to regular people. And one of the ways that we do that is trying to bring the latest scholarship in for interviews, right? That's what we want to do. But at the same time, we want to make it so that these very heady, sort of can be kind of elitist people that spend all their days in a library, be able to make that information accessible when they speak. So what we did, the way that we decided to do it was PhD students are broke, right? They don't have any money.
Yeah.
And they still need to travel and do these, go to museums and to collate texts and all these things. So what we decided was we were going to raise $2,500, $3,000, something like that. That'll send somebody to, to like the museum in Berlin for a week, 2 weeks, something like that, maybe, to collate their text, do what they need to do, and come back. And I think it'll provide them a reasonable amount of money. And what we said was all the Patreons that come on and donate, once we raise that money, we'll put out a call for proposals, and we have a means of doing that in the field. And then they'll send in all their papers to us, or their proposals to us. We'll kind of weed out the dumb ones. Sorry. We'll pick out the best 10 maybe. And then each of those students will come on and do an interview live. And everybody will see it, so that all this new scholarship that's good will be getting out there. Even if they don't get the money, they're putting their project out there. And then the Patreons, after all those interviews, the Patreons will come on and get to vote who they want to send to give the money to. Now, a problem that we realized pretty quickly was that if you give like $100 or something, Patreon takes some of that, right?
Yeah.
So Megan and I said, what we're going to do is, if Patreon takes $20 of the 100 or whatever it is that they take, from our own personal funds, we'll chip in that 20.
Close to 10%.
10%. Okay. So ultimately, we're going to be chipping in like at least $250 toward the $2,500, so that if somebody gives $10, all $10 goes to it. And it's actually pretty exciting, I think. I don't know why I started talking about that.
Getting back to the topic, if we can, I just want to make sure that, I know that the Winger did like one video that was an hour and a half, and I think he did another video that was also an hour and a half. So
it was.
He's done 3 hours bitching about me, and we've only been on here for an hour and 15 minutes, roughly thereabouts.
Yeah.
So we can't have adequately refuted all that he said. But you're certainly well spoken and well studied, and so I would like to see you in an opportunity to address him on a scholarly level, like, more or less directly. I don't think maybe a one-on-one, same time, real time debate would necessarily do, because I think with those type of debates, a lot of times people just want to see the train wreck. I think they're looking for the intellectual equivalent of a boxing match.
Indeed.
Yeah, but the scholarship certainly doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested in seeing you confront him on a more appropriate level, I think.
Well, I think we're actually moving that way, because that's where I was going with that. So when I came on Skylar's channel that night, I said, it's up on the Patreon. If Mike wants to become a Patreon, he can have a copy of it. Like 2 minutes later, he was a Patreon. He got an email. And it was nice. He could have donated like $1 to get it, but he donated 10, which was really nice. But so he has this paper. He has it in draft format. and I asked him not to share the draft format. I've got the finalized form here, so he can share the finalized form. So, but he has it. So I don't know what he's doing with it. I hope that what he's going to do is produce a response. And if it's him presenting a video where he tries to pick it apart, or he wants to, that's how we learn, right? That's how we move forward in this.
Now, you said that most of your work is peer reviewed, right?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of stuff, again, it's popular level. So I'm going to send it to another scholar in the field. But I don't write on things I don't know about, and even when I do write on them, I don't publish them or I make them available to people without other people in the know checking them.
I've had to comment because I'm always arguing against creationists, and creationists can never distinguish evolution from Big Bang cosmology. And I just have to come out and tell people, look, I don't know Big Bang, because I'll prove evolution to your satisfaction, but if you want to talk about where the universe came from, I don't know, and I don't care.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't matter. But I've had to argue cosmology over and over again, and I have to tell people, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. I don't, and neither do you.
Yeah.
So
that's
let's
right.
get back on the subject I know.
That's right. And I think that's one of the things that I don't like about the live debate. I'm not very good at it. And the reason that I'm not very good at it, part of it is my MS. It makes my brain suck under pressure.
I'm thinking muscular dystrophy. No, that's not
multiple sclerosis.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the other thing is, I was in a discussion last night, as a matter of fact, with a guy that was arguing that salt in Matthew chapter 5 and Luke 14, where Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth," that was gunpowder, and that Jesus was predicting or prophesying gunpowder, and it was actually evidence for the Second Amendment. Now, in that scenario, I don't like hurting people's feelings. That's part of my problem, or maybe it's not a problem. I don't know. So I tend to be very gentle. That's not very good in
work.
It wouldn't work out at the Ark, right? You can't be gentle with people out there with what's Kent Hovind's son's name?
Eric.
Eric Hovind, right? You can't be gentle.
These people don't appreciate scholarship. I mean, I understand that what the truth really is matters more than who did a better performance live on stage.
That's right.
I know that scientists are, these are people who they expect that they're going to be facing academics. They expect that they're going to be facing people who respect the criteria and the evidence. And if you present the peer-reviewed citations that this has actually happened, when he says there's no evidence of this, and you present the peer-reviewed citations for this, that they would respect that, but they don't realize they're going up against a con artist.
Yeah.
When they're going up against a Hovind. So the Hovinds will just hand wave and say, peer-reviewed evidence doesn't matter. That's all part of the big conspiracy. So, and so this is why professional scientists lose debates.
Yep.
Because a scientific debate, and really just any debate on scholarship, shouldn't be done live anyway. Because then it all becomes a stage show where the disingenuous party can pull anything he wants out of his ass.
Yeah.
Assert whatever he wants to, and how could you predict the things that he's going to pull out of his ass? There's no way you can rebut everything on the fly. I can tell you from my experience that every time that a creationist has argued that this or that hasn't happened, or that they have the scientific research on their side and they say that these studies say this, if they ever give you the document, you read it, and it doesn't say that.
Of course.
Now, in a written debate, you can always show, hey, it doesn't say anything like that. But you don't get to do that when you're on stage. So lies win when you're on stage.
Yep.
And that's why these things shouldn't be done live. And another reason is that, honestly, science and scholarship should be dispassionate. The truth really does matter, and that's what's more important than whoever prevails.
Yeah.
I had one of the worst arguments I ever had was with one of those Asperger's people who had no social skills at all. And I argued with this guy for 2 or 3 months over when I didn't know hardly anything at all about whether or not humans are currently monkeys.
Hmm.
And I argued on the side that humans are not monkeys. And it took me the longest time, and it probably would have been easier if he wasn't a complete, absolute, insufferable dick. But fortunately, it wasn't on a public venue that this argument was going on. It's more or less like in email and private messages. And I eventually had to concede that, and I even made a video called "Turns Out We Did Come from Monkeys."
Mm.
And when I made that video, I had to send him the link with an apology saying, you know what, you were right.
Yep.
And that was hard to do, especially because he's such a prick.
Yeah. Yep. But you know, that's the sign of an academic. That's the sign of a scholar, because it's not about winning. It's about getting it right. And that's the path forward, right? If you're only in this to win, you don't learn anything. That's the point. So, like my dissertation, for example, I had some ideas in my dissertation, and I put them forward. And my panel at my defense, they said, okay, it's a good idea. I don't agree with it, and here are some things that you need to. But here are some things that you need to deal with. Here are some things you need to engage with if this is going to work, right? And I have, like, my heart doesn't break if my theory isn't right. I don't really care, because the thing is, if I look at his third point and go, oh, of course, this doesn't, what I've said doesn't work, but that does, that opens this door. Now I can move forward. This is how academia works. So when your ego is tied to it, very problematic.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know if there's anything else we need to cover.
No, I think we're good.
I want to thank you, Dr. Bowen. What is it? Bowen?
Bowen, yeah.
Bowen? Okay, I want to make sure I was pronouncing it correctly. I really do appreciate you coming on like this, and I like your manner and the way you present yourself. It's difficult to tell when we have only talked in text up to this point, because I get a lot of cranks.
I can imagine
contacting me, and so you never know whether they're
Yeah.
going to be intelligible once you get on video. I've talked to a couple of people in email that say, yeah, this would be an interesting conversation, and then I don't even upload it, and nobody ever sees it, because
Yeah.
the guy ends up being some incoherent loon.
Yeah.
I had no idea, honestly, what to expect with you, and I'm pleasantly surprised.
Well, I appreciate that, and I really appreciate you having me on. And I guess this is sort of what I feel like my role is here on YouTube, or in this community, is sort of being a resource. So I'll just stop after this. But you had a conversation with General Han Solo, Rob Rowe, who I respect. I really like Rob. He's a good friend of mine. But he was saying some things about the Exodus, a particular book about the Exodus, and he was saying some things about the Hebrew, and I think in Genesis, and they just weren't right. But you don't know Hebrew, and you don't know about that book on the Exodus. So, I mean, what do you do? And I remember sitting there listening to the video going, I know that book. Jan Osman doesn't agree with Rob, anyway, so if I can ever be a resource in that way for you, or for anybody that I'm very happy to do that.
Well, I'm interested in following your career.
Oh, I appreciate that.
So I'm going to close it out. Let you say goodnight.
Well, thank you all very much.